right. Before I venture into the last lecture of this course, let me begin with a few remarks. The first is that I did send an email out to all of you, and I'm going to request that if you can just fill out the evaluation. You got a link to that, and you have until tomorrow morning. That's the registrar's deadline, is tomorrow morning 8 a.m. I think, to finish the evaluation. Secondly, I want to share with you the information that I had mentioned to you that on the final exam you would have 8 questions and you would answer 4. And I'm pleased to tell you that it's going to be actually a little better scenario than that even. You're going to get 10 questions and you'll answer 4 out of those. So you have a wider choice, and I'm reasonably hopeful that all of you will be able to attempt at least 4 of those 10 questions. Yes? No, there's no extra credit or anything of that kind. Yeah, okay. And finally, I'm just going to mention it because I'll have occasion to return to it during the course of my remarks to you this morning. But some of you might have awoken to the news. Usually that's how the news is these days, but you might have awoken to the news, and perhaps you didn't, that there's been shootings in Paradise. There were people I knew who were thinking of moving to New Zealand, and if you read the news, there are 50 people who just died in 2 shootings. Well, a single shooting, but at 2 different mosques by a white supremacist, which have left 50 people dead and a score of them injured, obviously all Muslims because they were all worshippers. And that actually really does point to some of the problems that I wanted to address in my remarks today. I mean, if you've done the reading, you know that one of the readings you had is Osama bin Laden's declaration of jihad. And there's an obvious relationship between all of these things. So today what I'm going to do is I'm going to just wrap up some of the comments that I had made in my previous lecture to you on women's rights. And then I want to move to what I'm going to call the 3 fundamentalisms of our era: the fundamentalisms of religion, the fundamentalisms of the market, and fundamentalisms of the empire. So that's essentially what we're going to do for today. But before we move to that, you'll recall this. I had shown you in quick sequence a number of these advertisements, and of course, apart from the misogyny of these advertisements and what they tell us about the position of women in American society, and you can see why I've been quite ironical when I talk to you about the fact that these are the same civilizations that have been preaching to the rest of the world. The Europeans, the French, the Germans, about how they put down women. And what we're really speaking about here is advertisements that were to be found in every American magazine routinely in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s. And it's not as though they've entirely disappeared, right? And of course, if we could have had a whole segment itself on advertising, what kind of dreams it creates in people, what is its relationship to consumption, because as I had remarked to you on a previous occasion, my own definition of poverty is that in the United States, if you're not consuming, you're a poor person. You have to buy into the consumption model. That's what everything is set up to do, and that's obviously what advertisement is set up to do as well. But these capture one slice of the social reality. But you'd be interested to know that if you look, for example, at higher education today, and if you look at, let's say, UCLA, and you look at what percentage of women are in computing, what percentage of graduates are female in computer sciences, the number is very low, as it is in mathematics and physics. But you'd be surprised to know, therefore, if you look at this slide over here. So this is women computer programmers with an ENIAC. ENIAC is an acronym for Electronic Numerical Integrator and Computer, which was built between 1943 and 1945. It's the first large-scale computer to run at electronic speed without being slowed by any mechanical parts. And there was a very long article in the New York Times only about 2-3 weeks ago, which points to the fact that proportionately there were more women in computing in the United States in 1965 than there are today. I mean, it's really quite astonishing. So, there are other slices of that history, and this article was entirely really on the women in computing, and partly because even though there were obviously stereotyped gender roles and all of that, in some ways we have made, you might say, a lot of progress, and in some ways there's actually been a kind of a regression. Right? And initially you find a large number of women involved in this kind of computing, all right? So if we were doing obviously a full-scale exploration of the evolution of women's rights and the women's movement in the United States and globally, we would have to obviously take into consideration the implications of World War II. Some of this really is in the aftermath of World War II, because you recall what I mentioned to you, that women had played a significant role, if I may use that word, manning the home front, right? Particularly when men go to war. And what happens in many of these situations, it's been noticed in a large number of countries, is that when the men come back from the war, then the women are once again made to retreat into the domestic sphere. And something similar, by the way, happens with questions of race. There's an interesting set of problems here that, that if you look at the American military in World War II, you find that there are obviously a large number of black servicemen, as there were. Of course, the numbers were much greater proportionally in Vietnam than was the case in World War II. But the same people who are now being charged with defending American freedoms, when they come back home, and particularly when they come back to the Deep South, they have to once again retreat into the world of segregation. Right? So it's a comparable situation in that sense, and I think we should always be alert to this kind of politics. But I want to end this particular segment on women by suggesting to you once again that there are these kind of stereotypical debates. For example, around veiling, Islam and the veil. I mean, there are billions of articles that have been written on this, and this is obviously what agitates a lot of people, particularly, I would argue, white supremacists, because the supposition, of course, is that this is always a form of suppression. I'm not inclined to take a position on this because I have my own particular difficulties with a number of religions, given my own politics. But what I do know is this, that if you look, for example, at this slide, now this is women protesting in Cairo in 1916. Right? There was, we shouldn't assume once again that there's only a women's movement over here in the West or in the liberal democracies. And if you look at the Algerian movement, the FLN, which I discussed with you very briefly, I mean, there's a wealth of scholarly work on the role that women played in the Algerian independence movement. And you can see that some of this really goes back to, obviously, the second decade, because at that point, of course, the Ottoman Empire, as you might recall, is beginning to crumble. There are emancipation movements, calls for freedom. And, of course, all these are complicated because some of these women are demonstrating not for women's rights necessarily. They are part of a regime of anti-colonialism. And what you find in anti-colonial movements very often is that they are patriarchal in their own way. Many anti-colonial movements have always argued to the women that, look, don't worry about women's rights right now. Right now we have to present a united front against the colonizer. And once we have independence, then we'll start addressing domestic issues. And of course, they never get around to addressing the domestic issues, right? So, but this is simply to show you that if you're looking at a modern day protest, there are precedents, there is a history there as well. They did not arise in a vacuum. especially what has happened in countries such as Tehran. There is a very famous Iranian human rights lawyer now, she's all over the news, who is presently being championed by many people in the West. But then I also worry about when people like that get championed by the West, because the West has its own agenda. And that agenda is partly to suggest that, hey, countries like Iran really don't know how to treat their women. Right? So I think that that's a kind of politics that I want you to be somewhat sensitive to. Now, as we move to the last segment, I want to direct my attention to what I've called the three fundamentalisms of our era. The fundamentalism of religion. And I use the word fundamentalism with some reservation. I use it for the sake of convenience. There is this project at the University of Chicago, a massive project that started when I was doing my PhD at that university, 3 decades ago, all right? More than 3 decades ago. And this, when I started there, and this was what was called the Fundamentalisms Project, because the supposition was that, well, we can see the emergence of religious fundamentalism. One problem with this, of course, and the people who are working on this are quite astute scholars. These are well-known scholars, but nevertheless, there is a problem, and that problem was that fundamentalism is really a category from Christianity. It really is. And many people actually don't really understand the origins of this term, but it really refers to people in the United States 100 years ago who were insisting on a literal reading of the Bible. Fundamentalism is a form of literalism as well, right? And because if we said, what would Hindu fundamentalism, for example, look like? The project is in the plural, fundamentalisms. Because the supposition was that, yes, there is Hindu fundamentalism, there is Islamic fundamentalism, Christian, Buddhist, etc. Right? And I have reservations, as I've expressed to you, because what it does is it takes a category which really arises out of the American condition and more broadly out of the condition of the Semitic faiths, and then plants it onto such things as Hinduism, Buddhism, and all of that. Because I know what Hindu extremism is, I don't know what Hindu fundamentalism is. Right? Partly because in religions such as Hinduism, we don't have, as it were, a kind of a scriptural authority of the sort that you have in Christianity or in Islam. There's something called the Vedas, which no one reads. In fact, you're not even supposed to read the Vedas. If I picked 100,000 Hindus, I can guarantee you not one of them has read the Vedas. All right? So those are the problems. But what it means is, as I said, a kind of a literalism, and then, of course, it begins to have an extended set of meanings. And when we do say literalism, we mean, for example, that if, let's say you find a passage in the New Testament which says that women should live under the rule of their husbands, for example, well, then the Christian fundamentalists will insist that that is indeed the notion of a good Christian life, and that's what women are bound to do, right? That's what a fundamentalist reading would be, all right? Of course, the fundamentalists understand that there are some things that you simply have to ignore, right? And that is for the sake of convenience, because there is also, there is obviously, when we're looking at something like fundamentalism, we are saying that even there, that the literal readings have to do with certain portions of the text and not with others. However, there are, I think, more pressing considerations we have to think about. One has to do with the role of religion in the public sphere. This is a question that goes back a very long period of time. And particularly, it started to come to the fore during the Enlightenment, right? Because this whole idea that religion was something that belonged in the private sphere, It is not something that belongs in the public sphere. And of course, this is where you begin to see a relationship with secularism. Now, when we speak about secularism, there is a standard version in the West of secularism, and the cliched expression, I'm sure all of you know that cliched expression, and that has to do with what's called the separation of church and state, right? That the state shall not intervene, so to speak, in matters of religion. And you know that, for example, in the United States Constitution, you have what is called the Establishment Clause, that the state shall do nothing that shall tend towards the establishment in any sense. And of course, that's what the court has to interpret that very often, right? The court has to interpret that. If, for example, there is a case going on right now, this has to do with a very large monument, which was actually built as a war monument. That is a monument to the dead of, I think it was not the Vietnam War, but maybe the Civil War, and it's in the shape of a cross, and it stands at a public thoroughfare, public crossing. And so there are some people who are saying that it should be removed because a cross is always a sign of Christianity. And the defenders are saying, well, it's actually a monument to the war dead. It's a monument in their memory, right? And so here the question comes, what do we mean by religion in the public sphere? What is the role of the state? And what do we understand by the notion of secularism? So I've given you the standard Western definition. In India, we actually have a very different reading of secularism. You have this reading, but the more dominant reading is not that the state shall not interfere in matters of religion, but if it does so, it must interfere on behalf of all religions. So, for example, in India, you have a holiday for December 25th, right? Christmas. You have holidays for Eid. Eid is the day, there are two Eids actually, two big Eids, which are celebrated by Muslims. Both of those days are holidays in India. The birthday of the Buddha is a holiday. The birthday of Mahavir, the founder of Jainism, is a holiday. The birthday of Guru Nanak, who is the founder of Sikhism, is a holiday. And of course, there are a number of Hindu holidays. Right? And this is really the Indian variant of secularism. If you're going to have a holiday on 25th December, to honor Christ and Christianity, well, then you must have it for all the others as well. And of course, I've always been puzzled by the fact that in the United States, being strictly a non-believer, it personally doesn't really affect me at all, but I've always been intrigued by the fact that in this secular nation, there are holidays for the Christian faith, but none for the Hindu faith or the Muslim faith or the Buddhist faith, right? And so, of course, you'd have to ask yourself, well, why is it that this country calls itself secular? And yes, I understand that there are different idioms of secularism, and obviously there are certain ways in which the Supreme Court weighs down on these questions and says that, well, we can't, for example, have religious instruction institutions such as this one, which would be required of everyone, right? So forth and so on. But when we're trying to understand the emergence of these of what you might describe as religious extremism, I'm saying that this is the backdrop for all of that. Now what we have seen is we have seen the emergence of the religious right in every part of the world. In every part of the world. Even in the non-Semitic faiths. I say even because it seems to me that it would be difficult to write a history of this going back to the 18th century or 17th century in India. Partly because Hinduism, for example, is a non-proselytizing faith, right? But there has been, and right now you have a virulent form of Hindu fundamentalism, and remember my reservations of that term, so let's say Hindu extremism in India at the moment. You have a government which frankly has allowed Hindu extremists the run of the street. They are people, roving mobs, who once in a while will pick up a Muslim who is believed to be transporting cattle or engaging in the beef trade. You know, the consumption of beef is taboo for Hindus. And these people have been killed. And I'm not saying that there are thousands of such cases, but there don't have to be thousands for this to be viewed as a problem. Right? If you've got a few dozen every year, that's a problem. Because, of course, it also instills fear in a group of people. And so what I'm saying is that there is unquestionably a certain kind of license that has been given. Of course, to these Hindu extremists, the problems, of course, run much, much deeper. And they run much deeper because fundamentally the problem, which I'm not going to be able to explain here at length, because it would really require an enormous articulation, but that has to do with how many religions have been transformed in the last 150 years in the image of Protestant Christianity. That the kind of Hinduism that the Hindu extremists are trying to create is actually a very Semitized form, a Semitic form of Hinduism. So the Hindu extremists want, for example, something comparable to the Quran or the New Testament, that every Hindu could read that and say, oh, this is our holy book. Right now, you've got literally hundreds of holy books among the Hindus. Right? So those are much deeper problems, how they understand the Hindu past, what is the nature of the Hindu past. But what I'm simply saying to you is that there has been a rise of religious extremism in India, and what you've seen is a kind of a Hindu nationalism, which is really, at this point, guiding the country's fortunes, unfortunately. Now you have a similar problem in Buddhism. No one really expected that of Buddhism, because Buddhism has long been viewed as a kind of a pacifist religion. That's how it's been viewed. I'm not suggesting that that's necessarily its history, but that's long been its representation. It has long been viewed as the religion of intellectuals. That if intellectuals have a religion, they ought not to have one. If you want to be an intellectual, that's really one view of the matter. But if you are going to have one, it should be something like Buddhism, right? A very philosophic religion, so forth and so on. But then if you know the history of Buddhism in Sri Lanka, Sri Lanka just went through a savage civil war, which lasted for 30 years. It ended officially about 10 years ago, but the Sinhala state, the Sinhala dominant state, was a Buddhist state, right? With a large number of course, Hindus and Muslims in the minority, and there is no question that there was religious oppression in Sri Lanka. So even a religion such as Buddhism, I'm saying to you, has seen a kind of a form of revivalism veering to extreme forms. And then, of course, we have the problem of Zionism in Palestine, which I've sort of adverted to in passing every now and then. And this, again, is an exceedingly complicated subject, because there are spiritual forms of Zionism and there are political forms of Zionism. There's a great Jewish theologian, Martin Buber, who also declared himself a Zionist, but his Zionism was very different than the kind of political Zionism that you find today. Right, and this takes us to the events of the last few hours. We're obviously seeing forms of Christian evangelical extremism come to the fore. The person who has been implicated he was caught alive in the shootings in the mosques in New Zealand. Issued a manifesto. This is a degradation of the word manifesto. These ramblings of these killers, they put something out and it's called a manifesto. Remember the Communist Manifesto? That's a manifesto. These ramblings of these killers are not manifestos, but that's what they're called in the press. And so if you look at this manifesto that he's released, I mean, it's essentially a compilation of white supremacist sentiments. It is no surprise at all that he mentions Donald Trump as a symbol of renewed white identity. No surprise at all. I think it should make you reflect on why all of these people are, invoking the name of Donald Trump and what Donald Trump himself really stands for. And then, of course, we come finally in this segment to the whole question, which is a question that I think has agitated the West for 20 years. I can't tell you how many books have been written on it, and how many more are likely to be written on it, and how many of them will suggest that we need to now go back to the Crusades, because I heard that this morning once again, that this is now another iteration of the Crusades, what's happening here, a fight between Christianity and Islam. And I've also heard those who have argued that, well, this is the abuse of religion. That's much too easy, too. That's like saying, well, when something goes wrong with technology, well, that's just the abuse of technology. There are systemic incipient problems in how religion has been cast in its institutionalized forms in most parts of the world, right? How religious teachings are transmitted. What is the role of institutions in transmitting these teachings? We would have to really reflect on all of that if we're going to understand this. There's, of course, other templates that have been given for this, such as the notion of Muslim grievance. So if this declaration by Osama bin Laden, right, where he talks about the occupation of Saudi Arabia. And then, if you're not really thinking and reflecting on it, you're saying, what occupation is he really talking about, right? Because, of course, Saudi Arabia is not occupied in the formal sense of the term by the United States, but in bin Laden's reading, it is. Why? A, because you have American military bases. Number one, you have American military bases. And I want to tell you, and this is where we intersect with fundamentalism 3, if you look at this slide here, okay, you know what this is? This is every red balloon there indicates an American military base. Okay? An American military base. If you wanted to write a history of globalization, I suggest you look at McDonald's and you look at American military bases. There are as many countries which have McDonald's as have American military bases. That's one way in which you can think about it. Or if you look at this, okay? So I'm intersecting with the third fundamentalism here for a moment. So this is just a small sliver here, US military bases in Central Asia and the Middle East. All right, and so wherever you see troops, wherever you see aeroplanes, all of these are American bases and troops, concentrations. And notice what is happening over here. Iran is completely surrounded. Completely surrounded. And then if you think to yourself, and of course when you hear Senator McConnell or Mark Rubio, some person like them who are really not very lettered people, if you ask me, because I don't think they've ever sat down and read and reflected, if you ask me personally, okay? And they'll tell you, oh, this Iran is the mega evil genius in the world right now. Well, if you were surrounded and had been your whole life by American planes and military troops, then you might begin to think how these people are going to react, right? And that is, frankly, fundamentally the case in many parts of the world. This is a different slide which just shows you all these yellow, okay, stars. All of these are American bases, with large concentrations of aircraft, troops, tanks. The whole country is ringed by them. Iran, completely surrounded. Right? And one of the things that you will not be told in most articles is that the history of this doesn't go back just to the Islamic Revolution, for which I have no brief either. I have nothing to defend about that either. It doesn't really, it interests me only as an intellectual and sociological issue and what happens in Iran, but I wouldn't describe myself as a defender of that, but I wouldn't describe myself as a defender of the regime that was overthrown by the revolution, right? 30 years ago, 40 years ago almost. But before that, long before that, there was a coup where the CIA overthrew a democratically elected government, right? And if you look at this over here, an article from The Guardian, that's why I'm giving you citations. Don't take my word for things. Go and look it up, right? You have all these slides made available to you. The military coup that overthrew Mossadegh, this is the person who was democratically elected, and his National Front cabinet was carried out under CIA direction as an act of US foreign policy. And Americans are always saying that they're trying to promote free elections around the world. Well, when there is an election somewhere, the first thing they try to do is overthrow the government that's been elected, if that government that's been elected is a government that they view as hostile to their interests. This has been the standard plank of American foreign policy for decades, all over the world. All right? Conceived and approved at the highest levels of government. Right? And this is from an internal CIA history called the Battle for Iran. So when you're trying to understand why things take shape as they do, right, then I think one has to understand the larger geopolitical picture that is involved here. No country or no people is just born with an animosity as such. These animosities are created. The embers of these flames have been lit in various ways, all right? And when we're going to the subject of Islamic extremism, as it's called, and I think there is a problem in Islam. There's no question about that. I think that those who want to simply whitewash this and say, well, no, this is all a reaction, no, I think there is a problem. But the question is, how are we going to understand it? Are we going to understand this as a history of Muslim grievances? Are we going to understand this as something that arises out of the fact that, and this is a common way of phrasing the argument, I'm not saying I accept it, but that's a very common way of phrasing the argument, namely that Islam has never been reconciled to the question of modernity, that it doesn't really know how to deal with the question of modernity and the modern age. Does it have to do with the fact that the Muslim world got left behind, right? Which is another narrative, that yes, there was this glorious period during the Middle Ages when in fact Greek learning was transmitted, right, to the West, which the West itself had forgotten, through the Islamic world, through the Arabs, right? And then over a period of time, this world went into decline, right? There are all these narratives. Obviously, we're not going to be able to consider them. But I'm suggesting to you that when we look at this question of Islamic extremism, do not be seduced into thinking that you can simply look at it as, some Muslim fanatics who are running loose, and that this is the inherent nature of the religion. The question is whether, in fact, all religions, and whether even secular forms of knowledge, which I've tried to suggest to you is the case, are necessarily flawed, that there are systemic problems in every form of knowledge, every form of knowing, right? So that's essentially a little bit of a template for you to think through this, all right? But one last comment needs to be added here, a crucial comment, which is that there are what we might call varieties of Islam. The largest Muslim populations in the world are not in the Arab world. I cannot emphasize that enough. The 4 countries with the largest Muslim population in the world are all outside the Arab world. Indonesia, Pakistan, India, Bangladesh. 3 of them are in South Asia. And as someone who's been reading Indian history and teaching it for over 3 decades now, I am fairly confident in saying to you that in South Asia, we created a kind of an Indo-Islamic civilization which shows, I think, adequately how Islam and Hinduism and a number of other religions inhabited the same sphere without any fundamental difficulty. It is only in the 20th century that these difficulties began to arise, fundamentally. And I know that there are, of course, competing views about that, but that's the view that I'm putting forward to you. And when people talk about Muslims being recruited for jihad, right? Some of you might have read about these young women who went from Britain, and a couple of them now want to come back. They went as jihadi brides They got married at the age of 17. They ran away from Britain, Muslim women who had grown up in Britain, and then they married ISIS fighters. These fighters have all been killed. It's been in the news, all over the news the last couple of months, right? Well, the interesting thing is that from India, there's really only a handful of Muslims out of a population of 200 million. Only a handful who went. They went from countries such as Britain and Germany and France, but not from India. Right? And that makes you think about, well, what is the position of the Muslim in India? You know, why is it that they have not been successful in recruiting them from a country such as India? All right? But that's not the only fundamentalism. We have to, in fact, want to make sure I get through this and leave a couple of minutes for some last comments. Fundamentalism of the market. So the thesis that was put forward by someone like Francis Fukuyama, for whom I have very little respect, to be quite honest, because he's one of those people who argued, well, yeah, you know, after the fall of the Soviet Union and the fall of the Berlin Wall, that, yeah, now actually all of humankind will be fulfilled, right? The evil enemy is gone. Everyone is now going to become captive to the only ideology that really matters, because it's the only sensible ideology. That is the ideology of the free market and liberalism. Right? That was the end of history thesis, as he called it. You know? And if you had to put it in a very cynical way, the argument seems to be that our only destiny is all of us will really be consumers. You know, we'll just go to Ralph's and spend a good bit of time, or Whole Foods if you're a little bit more elevated, you think, right? Then you go to the organic stuff, and, you know, we're going to spend time and we'll pick out, you know, gluten-free this and, you know, hormone-free chicken, this and that, and we'll just learn to be better consumers, and we'll all be fulfilled human beings, because that's what we were intended to do, was to celebrate the victory of the market. You know? And of course, while all of this is transpiring, the inequalities have sharpened all over the world. All over the world. A recent report indicates that 50 billionaires together, the top 50, own more than half the world's wealth. 50 out of a population of 7+ billion that we have in the world today. And in the United States, the top 15 own half of the wealth of the United States. Right? There were always inequalities. It would be naive to believe that there were not inequalities before. You know? The pre-colonial period had its own forms of inequalities, but I've tried to stress to you, if you think about the argument about the economy, the moral economy, remember, you know, that people looked out for each other in fundamental ways. There was a limit that people imposed upon their own greed and self-aggrandizement. I think those limits have completely been eviscerated. Completely been eviscerated. And in every country. This is not a particularly American problem. This is a problem everywhere. And it's as acute in Brazil, for example, and India, as it is in the United States. Of course, there are countries where the inequalities are not that sharp. Japan would probably be the most compelling example of a country where the inequalities simply aren't that sharp at all. Or some countries in Scandinavia, in Iceland, you know, and so on. You can pick a few of those countries, right? And this is all based, as I said, the kind of fundamentalism, I'm calling it. It's a fundamentalism. It's as insidious as religious fundamentalism, perhaps more so, because we are all captive to the ideology of the free market. This utopia of growth. I mean, all the economists at UCLA would lose their jobs the minute you said growth is not even worthwhile, because that's all they're arguing for. Just trying to create better models that would help us grow. Why do we need to grow more, necessarily? Right? Maybe we should grow mentally. Maybe we should see, why is it that our moral capacities to comprehend the world and to think through some of the problems have not at all become better or sharpened over the course of the last so many hundreds of years, while, of course, our ability to live with greater goods, number of goods, variety of goods continues to increase. I mean, it's like the house size. You know, neighborhoods I walk around, the houses are getting larger and larger and larger. You know, this is one of the ways in which you can simply track what's happened. The square footage of a home in the United States has changed dramatically. And the number of people living there is smaller and smaller. You know? So those are all, there are lots of forms of expression of this inequality. And then, of course, climate change has a fundamental relationship to that, because what it does, the whole problem suggests is that we're going to have to radically reduce levels of consumption. You know, the young, what's her name? Alexandria, what is it? AOC. She's, you know who I'm talking about, the young democratic socialist. I'm not going to here get into the whole question of what is democratic socialism for a moment. But what's interesting is the new Green Deal that she unveiled. I don't think it's as absurd as it's being described. I think that you're going to have to think about a future without cars in 10, 15 years in many parts of the world. You know, all right? And I'm suggesting to you that what she's really critiquing, even though her language may be very different, is, again, this fundamentalism of the market. That's what she's really critiquing, which is one reason why she's asking that income tax should be raised. And just in case you don't know, in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, the highest rate for personal income tax in the United States was 91%. 91. All right? You check it out. Again, there are tables and charts that will show you that very clearly. All right? And then finally we get to the fundamentalism of empire. There is an empire. And because you're all living in this country and we're at this university, it is important that we end with a reflection about the American empire. Right? And of course, these empires are not empires in the modern day empires, such as the American empire, are not an empire in the sense in which the Britain had an empire. You don't have colonization of countries in that fashion. There's still colonization going on. And you can actually speak about empires in different modes. You can speak about, for example, the empire of Facebook. You know? And that would be one way to think about empire too. But here I'm thinking really about an American empire. Now I've shown you segments of that because I've shown you the slides which look at American military bases around the world, right? The notion that the Americans have that they are the one indispensable power. This is in quotation marks because it's a phrase that's been used by endless number of American politicians and presidents over the course of the last several decades. You know, the fact that a war machine is critical, central to the American economy, right? That it has permeated. This is the military-industrial complex multiplied by a factor of 20 today, frankly. You know, that has permeated every pore of American society. You know, I don't understand, for example, why they have the ROTC on university campuses. Why, for example, are university campuses so hospitable to this? Why is it that retired Army generals are invited on bunch hall to give a talk about this or that, right? I mean, it really is something we should think about. Why has the university itself become so captive? And partly it has to do with this idea that American domination is an undisputed and ought to be an undisputed fact of life. And of course, when I speak about empire, we have to think about forms of cultural capital. That's the real empire too, that American forms of culture, and more so, that American social science, for example, has permeated every corner of the world. And that's what the Ford Foundation was doing, going back to the 1950s, you know. That the way in which people think about the world has been shaped by the categories created by people working at leading research institutions in the United States, right? But, and these are, of course, as I said to you, You've already seen these, so I think you get some idea of what I mean when I speak about the idea of an empire. This map is already a bit old here, but this shows the U.S. military footprint in the world. So, everything in red is countries with established U.S. sites and bases. Portions of of Africa now would have that too, because this goes back to 2008. And then you have offshore U.S. sites and bases as well, and countries with proposed U.S. sites and bases. That includes India. India doesn't have one yet. But if the collaboration between the U.S. government and the present Hindu nationalist government continues as it has been, and India is about to have an election in less than a month, I wouldn't be surprised if one day that happened in India as well, although that's not the case at the moment. All right? So we end with that, but let me make two more comments with which I want to conclude the course. So the first is, there is a small poem that was given to you. It's by this extraordinary German poet, Brecht. And there's just a portion of here which I have put in this PowerPoint slide. The poem is called "A Worker Reads History." Workers have their own worldview. Workers are very often autodidacts. Autodidacts are people who teach themselves. University is not the only place where people get educated. Sometimes they don't get educated at all in universities, actually. And they get educated elsewhere. They get educated on the streets, in factories. But here he's reflecting, and this is the last portion. Young Alexander conquered India, he alone? Caesar beat the Gauls. Was there not even a cook in his army? Fantastic irony, right, and reflection. That how do you represent the point of view of these people? Because really, what have we been attempting to do? We're trying to understand what are the ways of reading, what are the ways of interpreting. And your task is to continuously interpret, right? Philip of Spain wept as his fleet was sunk and destroyed. Were there no other tears? What about the others who cried? What about the sailors, for example? Right? Who writes history? Who is represented? Who represents whom? Frederick the Great triumphed in the 7 Years' War. Who triumphed with him? Each page of victory, at whose expense? The victory ball. Right? At whose expense? Why was Haiti paying reparations for 150 years? Every 10 years, a great man who paid the piper. So many particulars, so many questions. And it has really been my endeavor to leave you with questions too. That is why I think a decisive interpretation is not really possible. And if I may end on a very, very personal note, there is a right-wing American commentator. His name is David Horowitz. And David Horowitz, back in the late 1960s, 70s, was actually a left-wing commentator who was opposed to American intervention in the Vietnam War. Then he had a conversion. Just like Saul had a conversion and became Paul, so David Horowitz became David Horowitz, if I may put it this way. He became a horror to everyone else. And he had this conversion, and he started raving and ranting about what he called the left-wing conspiracy that was destroying America and American universities. And he wrote this book called The Professors, the 101 most dangerous academics in America. The 101 Dalmatians, right? And I'm honored to tell you that I'm the only professor at UCLA who made that list. So you can decide for yourself whether you have been contaminated and polluted. The difference, of course, between someone like Socrates, who was also charged with corrupting the morals of the youth. And remember what Socrates had to undergo. He was given hemlock poison. If you read Plato's Apology, it'll make you cry. It's a fantastic scene, really fantastic scene. He was made because he could have fled Athens, but he chose not to flee. The difference there is that, for one thing, I am, of course, a midget in comparison to Socrates. But the other difference is that I've not had to drink hemlock. I've just had to face a few, emails that were sent to me and are still sent to me, claiming that I'm a left-wing fanatic and I'm corrupting the youth and so forth and so on. So I think you'll decide for yourself. Thank you very much.